Okay, I think where I'm going to start off with is, as you know from the introduction and the template, it's about a call for reshaping our language provision. And that's a question, and it's for us to discuss. First 30 minutes, I'll give a bit of an input from the kind of school perspective and language perspective generally. If there are questions immediately, please stop me and we can have particular discussions on particular data aspects straight away. But then we will go into much further discussions after my input, I hope so, as well. From the program, you know the focus, and the outline is about giving you a brief overview where we're at in terms of language policy, but also particularly around the landscape of language learning in the UK and particularly in England. We'll touch on the policy direction in schools. We've got two big questions to, and there are lots of big questions in the room, but the two that I've chosen for today is, are university language departments ready for the changes ahead? And have university language departments a role to play as advocates for language learning and also languages in general? And I've put languages in brackets on purpose because I don't think it might be just language department. It might go much, much wider in terms of education departments. It might also involve other centres within the university, research centres, but also universities per se. And then I also want to allude to the recommendations that Mike Kelly pulled out of a recent publication, and for us to possibly use those also as a kind of impulse for further discussion points. Just a personal thought first, because the word Brexit is actually quite, for all of us, means something different. For the government, it means Brexit. For us, there is lots of emotions attached as well. And I think for me, many, many years ago, many discussion about the European Union started off in Austria. One of the Austrian journalists, Hugo Portisch, who I've always been very, very admiring, looking up to, is he wrote his book, Was jetzt, What Now? And the focus there was basically really, really highlighting, yes, we always focus on the economic impact of the European Union, but actually the peace project of the European Union gets forgotten. And I think I'm not very good at drawing, but I think this picture here by a student in the Northeast just summarizes where languages, the world, and the kind of idea of European Union for me sits as a peace project. And I'm not very good at going to these rallies, etc. I've never been a rally person in that sense. But I did go to the first one in Newcastle, and the remains are the two flags, which basically everyone who has to, is in the office, in my office, will have to cross these two flags in the office. Yes, so a statement of the discussion. And then the personal one is obviously Oliver, who is now 8 months, was 8 months yesterday. And he is, for our family, the kind of smiling addition after Brexit. And for him, I really want to ensure that the future, wherever we head, outside the European Union, within the European Union, we are really creating the right future for our next generation. So that's a kind of personal note here. And there will be now, I think, a period of the next 10 minutes, possibly negativity in terms of the picture of languages with some data. What I want us to do, however, is not forget that we have also a lot of success stories, and the success stories are the ones that I'd like to focus in the second half. But let's start off with, do we have a language policy? And generally, we say, well, actually, we haven't got one in the country. But I would argue that the Department for Education has actually set out a strategy that we all can sign up to university and beyond, in terms of what we find in the languages programs of study already at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 again. It's about learning a foreign language is a liberation from insularity. Quite an interesting statement in the discussions that we're in. It's about expressed ideas and thoughts in another language and to understand and respond to its speakers. It's also about new ways of thinking and the great literature. And obviously great literature has been widely discussed whether that should be in there at Key Stage 2 or not, but as an outset, it's there of the cultural aspect, the great literature as a part of our language policy. And then it's about providing a foundation for language learning and for other languages thereafter. So there is a direction. What is really interesting is we are, and the majority of us will know that anyway from our own experience, we are in a somewhat unique position in comparison to the continent, because our default first language is ? In terms of the school curriculum. Whereas in Europe, on the continent, the default first language is English in the majority of schools. So we have got to struggle that we actually have to adopt a very, very diversive idea to start with. And originally, when these programs of 2013, there was this list of 7 languages that should be taught in schools. And for obvious reasons, the government dropped it, because there was the lobby behind community languages, there were cultural forums and cultural institutes who basically said, hang on, my language needs to be covered. That's really important. We are supporting you as a government. Why are you dropping our language out of the curriculum? And therefore we stepped back, the government stepped back and said, that's it, you can choose at schools. So we haven't got the kind of logic first language, therefore also the issues around progression that we don't see on the continent as much. And then we've got the diversification of England. And I'm just going to touch, and the UK, touch upon those briefly. We could say there's no UK school system. We could say there's an English, a Welsh, a Northern Irish, and a Scottish school system. I would say actually when we look at the English school system, it's so diversified that we don't really have an English school system, because we've got different type of schools making different type of decisions, and if they make a really good argument for a good curriculum, then even Ofsted will agree to that particular curriculum. But in terms of languages, we've got the Welsh approach was bilingual +1, with a new Welsh strategy came in the summer, where actually a third of the population should be speaking Welsh to a very, very high level by 2030. And there's quite a lot of funding attached to that. The Northern Irish situation is much more complex, because although there is the will and the wish around the 1+2, there is, and this introduction of content and language integrated learning, we have got the issue around the kind of historic background of historic languages as well. So, and another side aspect here, we've got no German at any of the Northern Irish universities, and therefore we're going to see German being phased out in secondary schools as well, because obviously there's no logic progression then. If you study that subject, you can't actually study that at university within the Northern Irish system. Scotland's a number of people would say that they're the most advanced one, with a 1+2 strategy, with medium schools, with the language policy fully embedded in the curriculum of excellence. There are still implementation issues if you actually talk to teachers that there is possibly not enough funding, but also the training of teachers is still an issue. So there is the aim that primary school teachers should have a level 6 qualification as part of their degree in future. And then England, it's the first language plus ideally one additional one. In the curriculum, it set out that at primary level and at Key Stage 3 level, it's compulsory, but schools have got the freedom of actually deciding that certain cohorts of pupils will not engage with languages. Also, because it's Key Stage 3, more and more schools are pushing Key Stage 3, extending Key Stage, shortening Key Stage 3 and extending Key Stage 4, which means that actually less time is spent on languages in secondary schools. English Baccalaureate is the hope there in terms of that English, math, science, one language, and either geography or history are these 5 subjects that the student would have to pass in order to get an English Baccalaureate. And actually, they don't get a certificate. It's a pure school measure. So it's purely for league tables. They do not get a certificate that says English Baccalaureate, you've achieved that. So very, very diverse, lots of good pockets of practice, but also areas of improvement are needed, and most importantly, some areas of concerns on top of that. So let me summarize, in my view, some of these challenges and opportunities. There's the big question about societal importance of languages. And I'll go into a bit more detail in a minute. The enrollment onto language courses in general is a concern. And the data later on will give us a bit more insight in that. There is some evidence of that there are benefits of the primary language initiative. However, at the moment, still a very patchy picture. We haven't yet seen the impact, the full impact of the National Curriculum Reform 2014. We will get a bit more of an insight, hopefully, this summer when the first GCSE exams and A-level exams following the new specifications are actually assessed. Much more rigorous, and that will be quite an interesting one. What does it mean for us also in terms of universities? Will we see different kind of caliber of students coming through long term, or if we've got a much more rigorous system? Context and culture, I think one really, really important aspect that is refocusing, bringing not just the language skills development, but also wider aspects around context and culture into the classroom. I have put the orange kind of concern frame around this box. And the reason being that I think we still need quite a bit of work, and the question here is whether universities colleagues could help here, because a lot of us are dealing with particular aspects around context and culture and text, etc., to how we could really successfully embed that in secondary school, but also in primary schools. And in terms of language methodology, research and practice, we have in languages, in compared to other subjects, had a quite mixed picture there. And if you look at some of the reports from Ofsted, etc., there has been always negativity about the language pedagogy, boring delivery, etc., etc. And the challenge we see now, particularly through the introduction of these new exams, what has come back quite obviously into the language classrooms in secondary schools is the grammar translation method. And something else for us to think about. Linked to that, and I'll give you a bit of a summary a bit later on, is the publication of the Modern Foreign Languages Pedagogy Review by the Teaching School Council. So that's also an interesting element, that the policy makers have asked a school-led body to actually bring out the report, publish the report, focusing on the future of pedagogy. I think one of the hopes here, and that's why hopefully discussion will also go, is about partnerships with various stakeholders. And obviously there are also issues around partnerships, but there is a potential solution there. All this in the context of this. Sixth form funding has been considerably cut. Therefore, head teachers are forced to basically stop certain subjects. We are saying, the majority of head teachers are now saying that an affordable, a viable group is 15. Yeah? Now, I remember that the majority of our ITE students, for example, in languages would have been in classes of 4 or 5. Yeah? Very rarely would we look at numbers bigger than 10. So there needs to be a new solution in order to actually compensate for this kind of potential program. We have got consortium solutions, but is there another solution? Could universities be a solution? Could they be involved in a partnership idea? Teacher recruitment crisis. Now, this is not new. The reason I stayed a second year during my assistant year was partly because they couldn't find anyone else to teach German in a rather expensive city as Oxford is. So over the last 25, 30 years, we have struggled around this issue of teacher recruitment. At the moment, the crisis is particularly strong in those subjects linked to the EBAC. Because the government's drive is that in the next 5 to 7 years, 95% of a cohort should actually be engaging and achieving the EBAC. That might not be realistic, but that's the drive. And therefore, a policy drives the recruitment, and according to the recruitment, we haven't got it. If you think of the last year's graduates from languages across the country, 100% of those would have had to go into teaching to fill the gaps. Yeah, we've got about 6% going into teaching. Out of those, about 40% not into secondary or primary teaching, but actually into teaching in TEFL, etc., etc. So we are actually having a very, very small pool. So that is a challenge for the government and schools, obviously. And then on top of this is the question, how does Brexit affect that? Now, in terms of Brexit, we have had in May 2018, so just a month ago, the announcement by the European Commission that there is a restructure of the 1+2. There's a new commitment to the 1+2 initiative. However, with a slightly different message that the mother tongue might not be the mother tongue might be also the school language rather than focusing on mother tongue, and that's partly linked to the migration issue that in a lot of cases one of the languages is the school language that is different from the mother tongue. So that's an additional kind of aspect that the European Union has brought in. With all these recommendations, we are very clear, and we saw it with previously, it will then be discussed, but actually any education decision in the European Union is only a recommendation. So it's up to the country to then implement it or decide actually, yes, might be a really good recommendation, but not realistic for our context. Another element that Brexit has brought is a question around motivation and discourse in schools, particularly initially, where people have been challenged by saying, yeah, miss, but you're not going to be here for much longer, so you can't tell me off. Yeah? Or what's the point of what's the point of doing languages now as we're leaving the European Union? Yeah? So that was kind of initially the reports back to the Association for Language Learning, but in fairly small numbers. Even smaller numbers were the people who have decided to leave immediately. This has changed slightly. We have, particularly in the southeast, we have lost a number of really key head of departments who have decided, let's go and move back to Germany, France, Spain, etc. So there's a bit of a change happening. Linked to that is the teacher crisis. So the government is in the position that they need more teachers. As you will have heard from the press, we actually struggle recruiting in most of the subjects. This year, the applications have been down nearly 40%. So they've come up with an initiative to actually go to Spain, France and Germany to recruit. They've translated those into the adverts into foreign languages in order to attract people. But obviously people are not joining proactively because they don't quite know what they're signing up to. This might work when we know where we're heading, but at the moment it is not working. And the reason I'm saying that it might work is because when I first came to the UK, Austria wasn't part of the European Union either, and it worked. Yeah, I could work here, and we had our regulations, and it developed. But I think that is our challenge here. How are we going to make it work in order to make these people feel welcome? And another issue we've got is that colleagues generally, and we can hear it from the university colleagues, but also from school colleagues, are very careful themselves of using languages publicly. Yeah? Advice to, I've heard it not once or twice, but heard it several times, where people said, well, actually, I used to speak French to my daughter all the time, but on the metro or on the tube, I will no longer speak French. Yeah? This kind of mental kind of anxiety there for some people to actually saying, will I be challenged for using a different language? So if you look at the societal impact, and one of the first one that is always argued is the economic one. And when we look at the CBI reports, and it doesn't matter which way we're looking because the percentages are just changing 1 or 2% up and down, but basically employers tell us that languages is only very rarely an essential core competence for our work. So I'm just saying, why did I constantly say to my year nines, you need it for business in future, if you look at the statistics? Most important factors when recruiting graduates, languages are down here. But employer satisfaction with graduates, employability skills, when we look at that, actually the satisfaction is not great. So when we talk to employers and when we talk to them in more detail, the reason it doesn't appear on essential criteria is it would automatically mean hardly any applicants. So basically, let's take it out, put it into the desirable categories and criteria, and then we get a wider range of people applying. And if we really need a German, French, Spanish, etc. speaker, we might then have to actually train them up. Yeah? So there is the challenge of, do we want, yes, we want the language skills, but actually we want other skills as well. Let's look out there, what is on the market and who is on the market, and then develop it develop these people and their language skills. And then another one is much more the kind of message that the British Academy is trying to push around multilingual communication skills, international cultural awareness, but also much more thinking about the global employability. And that's an element that might get challenged with whatever Brexit and agreements we will have with the European Union about this kind of global employability. And will there be the argument about global employability left for us in the future? That's something to think about, whether it will look different or whether it will be particularly in English-speaking countries. Now, some of the figures of GCSE entrances in the last few years. So this one shows you the kind of overview from 2000 to 2015, where we had obviously not 100%, but 76%. Then we had a decision in 2004, where the government decided let's just drop languages as compulsory, and you can see that kind of decline from there. And then you see here the introduction of EBAC, where we've got a slight kind of pickup again. 2016 here, it drops off further, particularly French and German. Spanish, slight increase. The good news from the exam boards to date seems that there will be a 2 to 3% increase in this year's exams. So that's kind of a positive, potentially positive story. The question will be whether the 2%, last year was a fairly small cohort, whether the 2% is actually just purely because of a larger cohort size. Yeah. So there will be some discussions around it, but at least there's no further kind of drop happening. We were at the time here. We were very complacent in my school because we never had 100% compulsion in terms of languages. Our school had about 80%, and that was the head teacher's view. We can't force them to do that. Everyone who is able to should be, but we're not going to force them. Ofsted criticised us for that. However, because it was choice already in a way, we didn't actually do much. And that, oh, it will be fine for us, particularly in the middle of Oxford, where you've got the majority of people, about 60% of students were related to the Oxford University in some way. We won't have a problem. And our entrance figures dropped to about 50%. From 4 German classes, I had only 1. From smaller French classes, less French classes, Spanish struggled, and then we had to basically restart. The school is back up now with really great numbers, with particularly in A-level. It looks very promising with 14, 15 in French, over 20 students doing A-level, but it was hard work. Yeah. So the kind of complacence issue that we're saying, oh, because it was optional at the time, if it's actually officially optional, even those educated parents have not supported us, which we thought would just support us. And the arguments were very clear. One of the arguments was, well, languages are more difficult. And universities look at the application. If my son wants to get AAA, that's the predictions, then they will not do a language. Yeah, because it isn't likely that you don't get an AAA. Even if you predicted it. So that's kind of the aspect where decision-making is happening. I think there's also the regional aspect we mustn't forget. And obviously, coming and living in the Northeast, that's kind of the negative aspect from our perspective. But we've got inner London going down to Northeast. Obviously, in inner London, much more community languages. But there's a kind of diversification issue also in terms of opportunities across regional opportunities are not equal as such. The good news here was definitely to keep community languages in the curriculum, and that the government forced, in a way, the exam boards to keep all these languages as part of GCSE and A-level examinations. In A-level, we see a clear reduction over the last 20 years here. In all languages apart from Spanish, and the other languages have slightly increased as well. We are not expecting a further increase in the next cycle, partly because of changes to the sixth form curriculum, partly of the sixth form funding, and also it's worth highlighting that we have gone back to a 2-year A-level course, so we haven't got, many schools have dropped AS, and that is where we picked a lot of language students up, so we haven't got many language students entering AS. So that will be a kind of challenge for us as universities, language, but where are we picking up these students? Do we have to rethink the kind of curriculum quite considerably? What about ab initio? What do we do with the GCSEs? Are the GCSEs in future environments that we are considering? So it's all for us to consider in terms of the language departments. For the first time, there's also been a regional analysis done about A-level languages, and that gives us, again, a kind of bit of a north-south divide, but actually the northwest is doing still fairly well. But you've got, obviously, London leading on here. In terms of university entrances, this are, and some of you will be even more familiar with the figures than I am, but you've got 2016-17, a continued decline of about 7.8% to undergraduate level. We can see in the European languages from 2012-2016, we had 22% or 23% decline in applications. 2012 to 16, the same kind of time period. In non-European languages, we've got this 17.5 decrease. We have got a really, really success story around the kind of increase of participation. The question here is, in some of the universities, definitely kind of, what does it mean for progression? But there's a discussion to be had around that. We have got at the universities a teacher recruitment crisis, particularly into university PGCE courses. No funding for language specialism in PGCE primary. And fortunately, we've got some great success stories of university students getting the 28K British Council scholarships. You might be aware of those, that basically the government has given the British Council some of the money to deal with those IT students that have 2-1s or higher qualification. They apply, and there were about 500 people who applied this year, and 130 have received a scholarship. For next year will be 150 who will get these scholarships. And they've got some quite high-powered events in the sense. Some of them have been invited to meet the school minister. Some have been invited to the House of Lords to kind of give a perception of initial teacher training from students' perception. So they're trying to involve them at policy level as well. But these are there's some hard figures for us. And I think coming from a university where, and I'm in the School of Education, not in the language department, but where languages not even going clearing, you might think, oh, actually, languages is quite healthy. But actually, we also need to consider how many courses around us have closed, and therefore, some of the universities don't have to go into clearing because there's not that much choice left. And I think that's one of the challenges we have got as a sector. So, a quick break here, because there was lots of data. What I want us to do is, if you sit with a partner, if not, if you could just move closer. You've got a text here, And what I want you to do is read this text as dialogue. So the first line, the first person, the second line, the second person. Over to you. And if you work as threes, you can do A, B, C as well. Yeah, have a look here. No, it's fine, here. Here you go.
Oh God, I'll do the first one. Well,
Okay, for those people who have finished, I want you now to either reread it by you falling in love with each other or you having an argument with each other. You can choose. Thank you.
yeah.
Pardon?
What did you say we do next?
Either falling in love with each other
Oh my God.
or having an argument.
Okay, argument. And I think it's made up. I think it would be made up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Made up text based on a German poem, Christian Morgenstern, but there's a message hidden, is to actually get students very early on using, at the one hand, thinking about the kind of intonation, etc., but very much also thinking about giving them the encouragement and the motivation of performing and articulating in languages. One of the challenges we've got is in the classroom, and I'm not so sure whether the university sector is as affected as the school sector, but when you do CPD events for language teachers, a lot will react exactly as the students by basically saying, oh no, don't take me. Don't let me perform, yeah? And I've just had a training session at the Goethe Institute with about 50 head of departments. And it was one German native speaker who at the end was ready to perform, yeah? The others were quiet. So it's about also our mindset in terms of why are we sometimes worried, concerned, etc., in performing. And I remember vividly a professor in Oxford who always said to me, never ever do a presentation in a language that is not your mother tongue. And he will not, he's a professor of German, but he's English native. He will always speak in any public forum English because he's so concerned that anyone might go out and say, oh, he made a mistake there and then. Yeah? So if we've got that kind of anxiety, then we need to be really, really challenging ourselves because we need to be role models for our future learners. So, the two big questions I'm going to unpick very briefly, slightly differently after the negativity. I think one of the aspects we need to remember in the whole discussions are our learners, our future linguists. And I think the Scottish Curriculum of Excellence has summarized it quite nicely in terms of thinking around the reflective learner, the confident individual, the effective contributor, and also the responsible citizen. But the questions that we still have got is the learner will ask, why do we need two languages? How are you going to motivate me? And then, and there might be a better word, because I don't think age adequate is the right one, but what I mean here is Year 7 learners, we asked them to learn the colours. We asked them to learn individual words, phrases, etc. But actually, if we go into other curriculum areas, they discuss at really, really high level aspects around environment, society, etc., etc. And we are bringing them down into a kind of kindergarten age level in the language classroom, yeah? And we need to rethink that, yeah? And that's the argument possibly for this long-term strategy by starting early on in Key Stage 2. And I think the focus is very much on progression. On paper, I think reality looks different. And I think what we can see also is the funding has been minimal in terms of supporting the initiatives at primary level. Anyone who's interested in terms of assessment developments at Key Stage 2 primary, you might want to have a look at the different attempts around assessment. One of them is around the language magician, which is a language game to approach kind of assessment differently. There's a big question around raising language, culture and awareness from a young age, and that's a kind of key point why it's so important to have it at Key Stage 2 already, and also a drive to engage them with texts. And yes?
Sorry, just a quick question.
No, that's good.
Would you be prepared to share your slides with us?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
You don't have to keep
No, you can have all the slides, yeah. And I just want to give that as a couple of examples. Is that a text? Would you say it's a text? Yes, there's some nodding here, yeah. It's actually a poem by Ernst Jandl, but it's fantastic working with Year 4 and 5. You can send them off. First of all, you talk about the topic is the war, and then obviously it's May, when the war was over. But you ask them to write their own poems with colours, with hobbies, etc., and they can be really creative, how they interlink it to the various months. Sometimes around November and December, there might be a lot of grey written down, obviously, yeah? From their experience. But using that and exploring text very, very early on, and this is an example. Oops. Another one, and that's a possibly negative, it's a negative news story, but I think also a negative example of what is happening in schools. That day after that happened in France, we had a training session around curriculum development in secondary schools at the university for heads of departments. And what was really interesting, one of the questions I raised is, so how many of you used the opportunity to actually discuss it in your language lessons? Out of the 50 delegates, 2 people have chosen the opportunity to discuss that. The others said, oh, I've got so much in the curriculum that I actually just need to carry on. So we are missing opportunities. We are missing opportunities in our secondary schools, in our primary schools, to actually discuss current affairs. Although, from my perspective, the curriculum is not an excuse because it's actually not very prescriptive. It's the choice. It's possibly the prescriptiveness comes from textbooks and their chosen curriculum, but not from the government's kind of, there's no prescribed curriculum as such. I think, again, is there a role for universities to actually explore how do we work with cultural topics in schools? Could there be some CPD, some modules around working, and I know some have done work around translation, some have done work around films, but there's another piece of work to be done for universities around CPD and supporting colleagues in schools. Transition is a big issue. The transition from primary to secondary schools as one hand, and then the big transition, as you all will know, from universities once again to, from A-levels to university. So there's another kind of element of collaborative work possibly to be done. We don't know yet what the GCSE and A-level curriculum specifications will bring, and then the challenge for us as a language sector is also Progress 8 versus EBAC, because schools that are focusing on Progress 8 as a measure don't have to include languages. Yeah, Progress 8 does not include languages, whereas EBAC does. So there is a decision to be made by head teachers, and head teachers generally focus on Progress 8 rather than the EBAC as their kind of measure they want to be measured against. And I think one of the challenges in languages, from my perspective, is that we have been very, very driven by phases of language methodology. And we are very, very ideologistic around language methodology historically. And I think we can see that in all publications. There is, in all policy papers, you can you basically find again whether it is much more a grammar translation approach that is emerging, or whether it's a communicative approach emerging. And we've got slightly, so the pedagogy review, potentially a grammar translation approach emerging, where the focus is again on accuracy, errors, etc., etc. And then a really big issue for us, I think, in schools, more so than at universities, is the generic pedagogy approach in terms of CPD. Generally, schools will now not give much time to subjects' pedagogical development. The focus will be school generic policies and initiatives into curriculum development rather than focusing on subject. And I think the majority of you will be aware around the new specifications what we are expecting new of translations, grammar, spontaneous talk, more authentic materials. It's definitely a much more rigorous exam. And one of the challenges we've got is curriculum planning. It's the long-term planning that people didn't have to do because it was a very prescribed curriculum, and now they have to do it themselves. So there's some upskilling needed there as well. You will be able to read it on the slides. I'm not going through that, but I've summarized the key findings and the key recommendations from the MFL Pedagogy Review in particularly focusing Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 in 2 slides, and I've given you the link as well. So I think the way forward is this, that we start to collaborate. And collaboration involves everyone in terms of community, language community, policymakers, etc., 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 and us as universities here. And I think you could split that up further if you wanted to. And any of the language centres I've included into kind of mentally in the language departments. I'll give you one example how decision making is happening. No funding available at sixth form schools, so a head teacher might decide, okay, I need to drop something. Well, what am I going to drop? I'm going to drop, well, German is not recruiting, hasn't been recruiting. Well, I'm going to drop German. Yeah? Governors have supported it. What they haven't done is looked at the community that actually 2 miles or 3 miles down the road is an employer, Siemens, who brings in all middle management from Germany because he needs, the CEO needs German speakers. And instead of going around and actually coming back to the school, having a conversation with the school and look at potential collaborations. And it does work. We worked with BMW in Oxford at the time. They changed their entry criteria to basically allow apprenticeships, people coming in with a GCSE German. Our numbers of GCSE boys doing German quadrupled, because there was the opportunity of becoming an apprentice in BMW, and it was part of our advertising spiel in terms of how we would promote German. So it's the community, the businesses, but also the school leaders actively involved, as an example. We've got lots of examples, and just identified a few that are on my radar. There are research projects, obviously, and that's one of the challenges. Whether or not we're going to continue, and that's where the Brexit challenge comes in. Will schools be allowed to be involved in Erasmus Plus programs, which have been very much also allowed people to go abroad? Yeah. So that's one of the challenges we've got. I think the same at university, obviously, but in terms of the schools, that Erasmus Key Action 1 funding will be a challenge. Roots into languages activities, and it's always the question about sustainability. Some universities have kept on and put some funding towards it, but generally the national funding has gone. But we had some really, really good success stories there. Can we, as a partnership, continue doing something? What is emerging is this kind of university-based lectures contributing to GCSE and A-level classes through webinars, through video conferencing activities. And I've done it recently with a school not far from here. And we've done 10 sessions with the A-level German group, and really focused on the literature aspect around the topic they were discussing. So something, and I just happened to have written the kind of guide, but I think all of us in the room, or the majority of us, will have got a specialism in a particular area where it could, linking up with the school, could be an opportunity to actually explore this kind of webinar idea further. University Booster Days, Film Days, Ambassador Modules, and I've given you a link to an example how we at Newcastle University have developed that particular aspect. These are some examples where students and sixth formers, university students and sixth formers work together. So I think to conclude, two aspects to conclude is my thoughts to start with are summarized in the kind of picture here. We need to really, really start telling success stories and thinking about our Twitter feeds, etc. Have we got success stories of the year abroad, but also success stories in our individual classes that we can be much more proactive and thinking very logically, who are we going to copy into this tweet, which newspaper, etc., to really, really tagging the right people in to get a much, much wider audience of our success stories, rather than hidden at a university, somewhere on the university website, which the press office is not going to pick up because it's not a research-related story. So it's these kind of discussions that we can definitely have at university level. Nationally, we've tried to work much closer together, UCML and ALL, and we're trying to work also with the College of Teaching. We need to really watch the kind of idea around education in the negotiations with the EU. Where are we going to be sitting as a national level? And regionally, for me, it comes back to the collaboration of what's our regional university language contribution, what's the regional intelligence, and ideally, we might go into the local schools, but it might also be, can we actually drive a regional solution for language strategy or language provision, rather than leaving it to the individual schools? Can we actually come together and drive it with them and work with them in partnership? And to open the kind of discussion, here are also the recommendations that Kelly has pulled out from the various contributions in his edited book, Languages After Brexit. We've touched on some of this: raising the public profile, improve language education, improve international skills, the support for teachers, the community languages. So we've touched on a few of those. But now it's about really thinking, how are we, as a university sector, going to find responses and proactiveness in order to stop the negativity in the press and in the society about languages, and what contributions can we make? Thank you very much, and open for discussion.